Andy, you want to kick it or what?
Janice does.
Good,
Uh,
good morning, everyone. Welcome to the fourth annual Budget Line of Business Intro to Budget Form. This morning, the session is Reading Appropriation Law. My name is Janice Butler. I'm a Senior Advisor to Budget Line of Business Program Management Office. We have 25 partner agencies that pay a membership for you to be able to participate in trainings as well as technology solutions we develop. Today, the session is recorded. If you have any questions, please place them in the chat box and we will monitor it accordingly to make sure it is answered. I'm going to introduce your presenter for today. The presenter for today is Mark Weatherly. He's a principal at Weatherly Consulting LLC, whose clients include federal agencies, nonprofits, and commercial companies. He was formerly for a decade the OMB Deputy Associate Director for Housing, Treasury, and Commerce, with oversight of those agencies, plus SBA, the Postal Service, Fannie Mae, and Fannie Mac, the FDIC, and other federal financial agencies. Welcome, Mark. We'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Janice. And just a little bit more on me besides those agencies at OMB. Prior to that, I worked I was the Deputy Associate Director for Energy, Science, and Water. So that was the Department of Energy, NASA, NSF, and the Corps of Engineers. I started at OMB in the agriculture branch and was the ag branch chief. That was after a few years at the Congressional Budget Office. So I've worked on the majority, I guess, of agencies that are not defense and not health. So this morning we're going to talk about appropriations and how to figure out what they're trying to say. That's the appropriation bills. You can look at certainly one of the primary source documents for your program and your job, which I think was mentioned yesterday in the what makes a great budget analyst. It's really important to and useful to have an understanding, at least some rudimentary understanding of appropriation bills as part of your 360-degree understanding of your program. So their appropriations are a key stakeholder. And one thing I want to emphasize through all of this is that you don't have to be a lawyer to understand appropriations. There is a plain reading of the language that you can do, which in most cases is going to get you the idea of what they're trying to say. But unfortunately, it's important to demystify, I think, how to read appropriation bills and to understand them. I'm not a lawyer, but I've written language and I've appropriations language and negotiated some on the Hill. So what we're going to try to do in this class is help you to be able to find the key language for your program so that when your boss says, "What's in here for us?" and slides the bill across to you, you'll be able to tell her, well, it's got these funds and these instructions for our programs. And just so that to help you understand what this appropriation bill means for your agency, your program, and most importantly, your job. To be able to accomplish your job, it really helps to understand that appropriations context. And appropriations, of course, are pretty timely right now because we're about to run up against the expiration of the continuing resolution for appropriations, which I think is a week from this Friday. So if we have time at the end, we'll talk a little bit about continuing resolutions and shutdown situations when the appropriations expire. hopefully we do not get to, but these are uncharted waters that we're in now. So in the beginning here, just for a little context, we're going to discuss appropriation bills versus authorization bills. We're obviously focusing on appropriations, but authorizations are key as well. And the difference between discretionary spending and mandatory spending. Discretionary spending basically is anything that comes out of an appropriations bill. So let's get into that. Next slide. So here is an example on the left of an authorization bill and on the right of an appropriation bill that goes along with it. So the first thing to understand is that there are different committees that are authorizing committees than the appropriations committees. And usually authorization bills do not come along every year like appropriation bills do. But the authorization provides you with usually what the eligibility criteria is for the program, for example, and often sets boundaries for what kind of appropriations subsequently should follow. So on the left, you'll see we'll be looking here at maternal and child health services block grants. And you'll see in this language on the left, this section 501 down at the bottom. The last sentence says there are authorized to be appropriated $850 million. So that's the key, is that it has therefore told the Appropriations Committee, yep, this program is good to go, and we suggest $850 million. On the right is the subsequent appropriation bill for that program that came along. And you'll see it references this section 501, and it says about halfway through that paragraph on the right, not more than 119 million shall be available for carrying out this stuff in section 501A2. So it refers back to this section 501 in the authorization bill. One interesting thing to notice is that while the authorization says there's authorized to be appropriated 850 million, this appropriation only provides at 119 million. So that's an example of that the authorizers and the appropriators don't always see eye to eye. And often people mistakenly think that if they get a big number in an authorization bill, like 850 million, that that's how much money they have, or that's how much money they will have. But the appropriations do not have to go along with it. And often they don't have the room to be able to fund all as much as is authorized. So that's increasingly going to be the case. So that's authorization versus appropriation bills, different committees, different bills. Next slide, please. Appropriations are always needed. I think yesterday also, Andy quoted, I think, that sentence in the Constitution that says, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury except appropriations made by law. So there is appropriations in this case, in the lowercase a appropriation. It just means designating money out of the Treasury to be spent. So on the left, you see discretionary versus mandatory funding. And down here in the pie chart splits out the discretionary spending from the mandatory spending. And the discretionary spending you'll see is a small slice, 11% for defense and 14% for the rest of the programs. The mandatory large slice there, of course, are things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the public debt. So those expenses continue, and the funding continues year after year, even if there is not an annual bill done. So our focus here is going to be on, of course, these discretionary spending. And from here out, when we say appropriations, I'll refer to the Appropriations Committee. Even though there are mandatory appropriations, I think it gets confusing. So let's just think of appropriations that are coming out of the Appropriations Committee, and that's discretionary spending. One important distinction between those two, discretionary and mandatory, is what the control is on the spending. For discretionary funds, the control is that there's a cap on the amount of money that can be provided through appropriation bills. So those discretionary caps are what the total of 12 bills has to fit within. In contrast, for mandatory programs, the funding control is something called pay-as-you-go, which many of you know, of course, means in general is if a piece of legislation increases mandatory spending, it's supposed to be offset somewhere by savings. And that expenses on the mandatory side can include not just Medicare, Medicaid, but it also includes tax cuts. So, for instance, we're looking at the extension of the tax cuts that is expected to be in the one big beautiful bill that the president has talked about. It's $4 trillion in lost revenue due to those tax cuts. I don't think it's going to be offset, but we'll see what they do. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned, in the appropriations funding is controlled by the cap. Currently, these caps were set by the 2023 Fiscal Responsibility Act, which is the deal basically that cost Speaker Kevin McCarthy his job, but it at least allowed for spending and appropriations to continue for a few years. So here we have the caps. You'll see that defense increases slightly in 24 and 25, but the non-defense spending is not really increasing. That's going to be an issue for the upcoming negotiations. But as we'll see, there are certain ways around these caps or ways to augment and increase discretionary spending through appropriations that is important to understand, so that these numbers here, in fact, are not going to be what we end up with at the end of the day. It'd probably be slightly higher for non-defense, but these caps go through this current year, FY25, and in the future, Congress will have to decide what the cap is for discretionary spending and appropriations going forward. Next slide, please. This is a bit of a review. I know you went over this yesterday somewhat, but it's important to understand these concepts of obligations and budget. That is where the control is in the appropriation bill. It sets limits on obligations that can be entered into. It provides budget authority to enter into those obligations, and the outlays are just follow along and vary differently from program to program. But the point of control, of course, is obligations. Deficit effect is our outlays. So again, as we discussed yesterday, that the debt limit is basically driven by outlays and the deficit, but our focus here is on obligations and budget authority that is being set in the appropriation bill. Next slide, please. So now that we've gone over the context a little bit, let's get into how do we find your program inside of the bill, and how can we get to the language that you need for your job. So here, well, let's go to the next slide, Dan. The first thing to see is that these divisions, in this case, refer to individual appropriation bills. So there are 12 appropriation bills. It's been a long time since the 12 were passed individually, one by one. More often they get thrown into omnibuses or minibuses where they throw several bills, if not all of them, together. So the first task is to figure out which of the 12 bills your agency and program are in, and then to zero in on it. So the appropriation acts in this case are delineated by the Division A or Division C. Next slide, please. So that's the division. I'll tell you what the appropriations is. Then you're looking for your agency, because each of these 12 bills funds several agencies, and that's the title there. Title 1 here is the Department of Labor. In the bottom example, under the Energy Water Act, you'll see that Title 4 are independent agencies, and this is generally each of the appropriation bills has a collection of independent agencies, smaller agencies that it funds. And that's where you would have to look for smaller agencies such as the Appalachian Regional Commission. Next slide, please. And then within your agency, then you find your program, which in this case highlighted the Training and Employment Services underneath the Department of Labor. So you find your division, which bill are you in, your title, which agency are you in, and then your account, or you find your program. Next slide, please. One sort of helpful thing is that the appropriations language does not change much year to year. And as you get used to looking for your programs and reading it, you'll be able to, over time, see what little changes there are. So, bless you. This slide highlights some of the changes that were made from 2015 on the left to 2020 on the right. So in 5 years, what changed? Well, the first one obviously is the total appropriation changed. All the other languages the same. Then it added a set aside for a program that was newly created in 2018, this First Step Act. Then there was a technical change allowing HHS to transfer funds. And finally, they changed how long the money is available for. And in this case, I guess I referred to, it's not these contract confinement funds, but you'll see that on the left here, there was 50 million made available for operations through 2016. So that was 1 year money. On the right, you'll see that 50 million now will be available until expended. That means it lasts longer than just 1 year. So take heart, at least, that the language doesn't jump around, and they always start with last year's language. When you look at the president's budget in the budget appendix, they will repeat the appropriations language that was enacted and then show in italics what the president would like to change or new language, and they will bracket the old language. So again, when you look at the appendix, budget appendix, it's more clearly seen what the changes are from last year. Next slide, please. All right, so now we're going to get into the key part of what is it you're looking for? Next slide. And within, well, for each program, there are three essential things, essential elements. First one here is the purpose, what's the money for? Secondly is how much money is available, the amount. And thirdly will be the time that the funds are available for obligation. So let's start with the purpose. What on earth are these funds being provided for? So here we have an example of what the numbers mean at the bottom. Sorry, I'll get back to that question. So the first site here is that it says this money is being provided to carry out titles 3, 11, 12, blah, blah, blah of this particular act. So it grounds this funding in an authorization statute that says, yes, it is proper that funds be provided for this. And this has become more important, this grounding in legislation of what this program or this activity is authorized to do. There are teams, DOGE teams and others who are looking at activities and programs now, as you're all aware, and determining as part of it, is this required? Is this a required expenditure of the government? Where does it say that taxpayer funds should be spent for this activity? And here's the answer. It says in these particular authorization bills that money shall be provided for this. This example here is pretty specific. It says for these titles and this activity. Next slide provides an example that is a little less specific about the grounding and statute about the expenses. This is for the Kennedy Center, and it just says for expenses for the operation, maintenance, and security of the Kennedy Center, they're provided here $25 million. That's pretty vague. Of course, Kennedy Center is a small thing, but that's vague. But if you think that's vague, next slide, I think is even more general.
Mark?
Yes.
May have been on a previous slide, but there's a question. Can the presenter please explain what the little numbers mean at the bottom underneath the appropriation language?
Yeah, I think, as you know, that PL 116, for instance, that's the public law. So that references the authorization bill, when it was enacted and what statute it was in. So when you're looking up, which I would recommend doing, your program's authorization language, these little numbers and indicators will tell you where to look. President's budget appendix does it a little more clearly, where it says it has the U.S. code site, and I think that's what these numbers are. I can't quite see that, but generally they'll provide the bill, PL, and then what section in the bill or in the statute you can find this language that the appropriation cites. Interestingly, see this as opposed to the previous one that says, you know, for title this, that, and the other of that bill. This doesn't, the language here doesn't reference a specific bill, but it does provide a code site, I guess, for the original authorization for the Kennedy Center. I hope that helps. Next slide. Okay, so now we know what the purpose is, and it's grounded in law. Yes, it's okay. Now, how much money are we talking about? Often this is pretty easy to spot. Next slide, please. How much money we're talking about, again, for maternal and child health, $943 million, $784,000. For the Kennedy Center has a specific amount of money. So those examples are easy. Um, Sometimes you got to do a little bit more digging though to figure out how much your program or your sub program has. Next slide, please. So often there are of whiches language that says, you know, here's $100 of which 10 shall be spent on gasoline or whatever. So in this example for the Smithsonian, you can see that of the amount of money provided, it puts an upward limit on purchase, rental, repair, and cleaning of uniforms for employees. Another thing that is often pulled out is how much money is available for conferences, say that an agency may have, or sometimes you know for furniture, and they can be pretty specific. So you start with the overall amount for a purpose, and then you have to look to these of whiches to figure out what individual activities are being called out within that. Next slide, please. Those were all examples of the usual case where money is drawn from the Treasury for these activities. There are, however, excuse me, other sources of funds than Treasury and issuing Treasury bonds, such as user fees or receipts. These are pretty important for a number of reasons, but there are some activities that are totally funded by user fees. For example, the Patent and Trademark Office within the Department of Commerce is a $3 billion a year operation that is totally funded on user fees paid by those who are seeking a patent. They pay a fee for that. So the appropriations in that case just sets a limit on it. Now, in this example, the National Telecom and Information Administration, this is the agency within Commerce that manages the spectrum use that agencies have. So it's sort of the government's central spectrum and internet bandwidth agency. It funds its operations basically by passing the hat among agencies. So as the language says on the right, Secretary of Commerce shall charge federal agencies for the costs that they incur in spectrum management. Note that there's no dollar amount mentioned there. It just says, no, Secretary of Commerce, you just go charge what the amount is that you're spending. You figure that out, and you also figure out how much to charge each agency, maybe depending on how much spectrum or bandwidth they use. But as another example, for instance, Food Safety Inspection Service within the Department of Agriculture. These are your meat and poultry inspectors, whose main shift is paid by taxpayers. But if they work overtime, these federal inspectors, the company, the meat company, pays their overtime expenses. So there are different sources, basically, is what I'm saying, for different activities. One key factor that may come up is during a shutdown situation is since these fees, like recreation fees for the Forest Service and Park Service, are a source of funding. In the last shutdown, in the previous Trump administration, the Washington Monument and a number of other sites that the public uses were actually kept open, unlike previous such shutdowns, because the administration interpreted the fact that the user fees were available without appropriations, and that people, even if the appropriations lapsed, people are going to go to parks and they're going to pay their parking fee, and that money can be used to operate the park or the forest. So you have to understand whether there are these other sources for your program or your activities, but be aware that not all are appropriations out of the Treasury. Next slide. The third element here, now we've talked about what the money is for and how much money we're talking about, is how long is the money available, the time that the agency has to obligate the funds. This is, in general, just to give you a quick overview on time, in general, money is available in appropriations for 1 year. Salaries and expenses money, for instance, is generally just 1 year money. So if you don't use it all by the end of the year, September 30th, it lapses. And it's important to understand how much time you have to obligate and when the money lapses and when is the point that you can no longer obligate it. There was a point of confusion in a Doge claim about savings, for example, that relates to how long money is available. I think they, a couple of weeks ago, cited a $2 billion savings that they found in HUD money that was from 2019 that was still on the books. And so they, as they said, they blocked that money from being spent and claimed 2 billion in savings. Well, the fact is that the money was only available for a couple years, and after 2020, it could not be obligated. It lapsed. It went away. So to claim that that you have savings from money that has already lapsed is not correct, because they could never have spent it anyway. So you got to understand how much time you got to spend this thing. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, yeah, unless you state otherwise, the money is generally available for 1 year. There are, as always, some exceptions to that, but you got to look to the language to understand it. For instance, in the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, this is a weird animal because it actually, the appropriation is provided for 2 years hence. It's a advance appropriation that provides the money 2 years before it can be obligated. The reason for that, I think, is basically they want to remove the political influence on programming, so that if your local PBS station runs some program that some members of Congress don't like, they don't go out and try to yank the money back from the Corporation of Public Broadcasting, because basically that money was provided 2 years ago. It'd be interesting to see what becomes of this funding in the president's budget coming up. But anyway, so that's an odd example where there's money provided for 2 years forward. The second example here on the Kennedy Center is an example of what a lot of agencies consider the holy grail of time availability, which is this money is available till expended. It never lapses. This is rare that that kind of flexibility is provided and that discretion. And there are agencies, I've worked with agencies for years who have tried to extend, for instance, their salaries and expense money from being 1 year money to 2 year money, which can make a huge difference in spending. And then I've seen, as I'm sure a lot of you have, September comes around, the money's about to lapse. You're going to hurry up and find ways to spend it. So sometimes, lower priority things get bought during September. Whereas if the money was money had been available for 2 more years, the agency wouldn't feel so pressured in hurrying up and spending the money, and might, spend it on more useful or long-term investments. But anyway, it's obviously really crucial to understand how long the money is available, how long do I have to spend it, and when does it go away. Next slide, please. This is an example of 3-year money in the Army. It was written in 2020, and it says it's available through the end of fiscal 22. And then the bottom example is a rarity where it's just all out of whack with the fiscal year. It's I think it was provided for 6 months or so. Next slide. All right, so that's a really crucial segment here that we just finished up. What's the money for? The purpose? How much are we talking about? Is it specified, or do you have to estimate it, like overtime user fees? And finally, how long the money is available for, and when does it lapse? This may be a good point to take a break, Andy. Could you go to the next slide just to check that? Yeah, this next segment on amending authorizing statutes is increasingly important. But what do you think it should? Should we continue or take a break here?
Good time. Let's take a break. Let's come back at 9:45. That's a 9-minute break. Does that work for everyone? Okay. See you at 9:45.
Just a friendly reminder that the presentation for today was attached to the invite, as well as it's on our agenda and presentation page. I'm going to put that link, include that link in the chat for you.
No, I get it. And I understand.
Also, at the end of this session today, not this session, but at the end of the day, you will receive a post survey. We really would appreciate your input as to how did you enjoy the survey, any recommendations for improvement.
And we do take those seriously. Like your comments, people's comments in the past have made a difference and improved the program. So we really look forward to those.
Also, check out Budget LoB has a new homepage. Check that out. It'll list, you'll see the partner agencies, upcoming training, what budget systems we have available, if you need any new tools for your organization.
I'd just like to say that in this yesterday and today's training has been so wonderful and useful.
Awesome. Thank you for that feedback. Please
Thank
do.
you.
Please do
My
include that on the
recommendation
survey.
would be to split the days up because it's so much information that by the end of the day, I know I was like drained trying to, absorb everything and making notes and stuff.
So are you saying you'd rather have like 4 mornings instead of 2 days?
Yeah. Or like maybe do 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, 2 days in a row, and then next week do it so people actually have time to absorb the information. And then because it all ties so much together, I think if you give people time to absorb the information, then more questions come up because people have time to think about it and kind of play with it. And so then the next day or even in the afternoon when you come back, people like, I know I had questions. I was like, oh man, I could ask this now, It's just
That's
there's
very good feedback. If you would
Yeah.
put that on the survey for us, then
absolutely.
we'll be able to record it and make some adjustments for the next form. We really appreciate that. Please do include that in the survey.
And everybody
Also,
We
else.
will, but
if you have not subscribed to our newsletter, please do subscribe to our newsletter because that's going to inform you of what's going on with Budget Line of Business, and it's going to inform you of upcoming trainings and as well as forums. Also, we do have work groups. We have a federal budgetary work group, a data analytic work group, the analytics and Power BI, other topics, and federal budgetary work group is a group where budget analysts come together to network. We're planning on having a mentor program through this particular group. Is where you come is not, it's basically your group is not guided by our trainers. We do have co-leads that are budget analysts as well. We have 2 co-leads, and basically it's a platform where you can feel safe and come and talk about your budget issues, or if you want a particular presenter to come in from OMB or what have you, you'll do that together to make that happen. So consider joining that particular group. We also have some upcoming trainings. There will be upcoming training in March on the question for the record. We also have a budget system to assist you with submitting your questions for the record. They will demo that on March 18th. We do have a career development combo section, and it's the title is Eating the Frog, Leadership Life Hack for Productivity. That's going to be March 27th. And our spring expo will be on site at Department of Education. The tentative date for that is May 14th. Also, if you subscribe to the newsletter, this information will be included. So those are Budget LoB announcements for the day. Thank you so much.
Okay, we'll get ready to start in about 60 seconds. Okay, let's go. Good. All right, Mark.
Yeah. And we're back. This section next we're going to talk about is really important. It seems obscure. It is obscure that these amending authorizing statutes or changes in mandatory programs or chimps. This is when an appropriation bill meddles with authorization bills or seemingly strays outside of its lane. But the fact is, legislation, as you all are aware, in the last X number of years has become increasingly difficult to move through the House and Senate. So the number of bills going through are fewer. Appropriation bills is one of those must-do bills. So due to the lack of trains leaving the station, legislative trains, appropriation bills have become a magnet for changes, not just in appropriations programs, but in other programs. But this is something that it's important to look for. And again, it's an increasing practice, this amending authorizing statutes through an appropriation bills. It's technically a no-no. The authorizers, take great pride in their work. They don't like the Appropriations Committee meddling with it too much. But again, it's unavoidable, and in many cases, it's a useful thing that they do. So here's an easy example where an appropriation bill is messing not with numbers or funding, it's a language chimp. So on the left here, you see the CEQ within the Office of the President was originally authorized to have 3 members. So, but the appropriation bill came along some years later and said this council shall consist of 1 member. So that's obviously, that's kind of a crucial detail as to how that agency is organized. But for whatever reason, maybe they couldn't get a quorum. I don't know. Maybe they wanted to have budget savings and only fund 1 board member rather than 3. But the appropriations language changed that. So you got to look for that. So that's a good example of a language chimp. The more crucial and frequently used is a funding chimp. Next slide, please. That is when an appropriation bill changes the amount of money available through an authorization bill. So in this case, in the health workforce, the appropriation bill included a sentence says that no funds are going to be available for this particular activity found in section 340G-1. So that in that case, that just changed for where the money would go. Often in a funding chimp, the appropriation bill will block some mandatory money. For example, within the Department of Agriculture, there's a conservation reserve program that in the Farm Bill, which comes along every 5 years, says, let's say there shall be 30 million acres enrolled in this program. Appropriation bills have come along and said, no, we're going to change that to 25 million acres. So they lowered the amount that can be enrolled by 5 million acres, and the appropriators claimed savings for that because obviously for 5 million fewer acres, you don't need as much money. So they got themselves some funding savings from that kind of an action. Another recent example is IRS funding. I'm sure you've all seen the great controversies about appropriations rescinding, taking back money that was provided for IRS enforcement. I think there was $80 billion or so that was provided to the IRS in the Inflation Reduction Act. So that was mandatory money that was supposed to increase IRS enforcement spending, which, having worked on that for a number of years, that kind of enforcement spending pays for itself 4 or 5 times over. You hire a few more enforcement people, they do a better job of collecting taxes, they reduce the deficit. Nevertheless, last year, Congress rescinded $20 billion of that, and so claimed savings and spent the money elsewhere. Next slide, please. This is how this figures in. You remember that slide we went in the beginning that showed the discretionary caps. That's the first 2 lines up there defense and non-defense. So that's what that agreement said shall be provided for defense and non-defense spending. The section below, though, lists some a side deal that was part of the agreement, though was not in writing. It was a side deal to find ways to increase that non-defense spending, whose total otherwise would drop. So you'll see down there, there's a line for chimps, $15 billion they found by cutting mandatory programs such as like the Conservation Reserve Program move. And then secondly is listed the IRS rescission of 20 billion in 24. While in FY25, of course, they're writing the bills. Hopefully they'll have one by next Friday. OMB sent up a list of what it would like to see in a full year CR, and among those is another 20 billion from the IRS. So even though it says TBD over there in the right column, I think that's one that is likely to be enacted in 25. Other moves that they use to increase spending, you'll see redirect COVID money. That money was provided in authorization bills, and the appropriation bill basically said, now take that money down and spend it on this other stuff. But it claims savings for redirecting the COVID money. Another way around these discretionary caps is emergency spending. And this would be for FEMA and disasters. But there were also a number of activities that are not really emergencies that were nevertheless designated as emergencies to avoid being counted against the cap. So there are ways around it. But the point here is that these chimps and having appropriations meddling in authorization activities is an increasing practice. And it's one you have to be aware of, particularly if you have programs in your agency that have mandatory funding, not just appropriated funding. Next slide, please. Now we're going to move on quickly. I want to cover a couple of other topics of things you find in the appropriation bill. Community funding projects, alias congressional earmarks, have staged a comeback. They ended in 2011, and you may recall these stories of bridges being built to nowhere and other earmarks that were of questionable merit. So they were gone for a decade, but now they roared back in 2020. These congressional earmarks in a big way. I mean, we're talking, I think there may be $10 billion of these earmarks. Where do you find them? They're not usually in the appropriations language, but they're obviously key. Next slide, please. Usually they are found in report, but here is language that says the last couple sentences you'll find under the heading Health Resources and Services in the explanatory statement, these projects. So it's usually the report accompanying the appropriation bill that lists these congressional earmarks. And we've got a couple examples of that. Next slide, please. So here's a listing right out of a report of community health, and these are health earmarks. You can see they go on and are very detailed. Next slide, please. And there are so many of them. This is just an example of that. Next slide, please. So those are earmarks. One last comment on earmarks. If we have a full year continuing resolution next Friday, that is, rather than do individual bills, they just extend the continuing resolution for the rest of the year. Whether there will be earmarks is going to be a very key decision. Usually under a continuing resolution, earmarks do not go forward. Even though the House and Senate have their lists of earmarks for FY25, they may sit on the shelf if there's a full year CR, but that remains to be seen. Another element in the back of the bills are these general provisions. So here are some examples of general provisions. This one applies only to the title, that is just this appropriation bill. And this general provision these things, you have to look for them because they're going to give instructions for your program that are not found under the usual heading for the program. These are in the back of the bill, but there's often really important stuff tucked away in the back of the bill in these general provisions. This example here says you can't use these funds to promote gun control. And it also, the second example there provides the director of NIH with the authority to transfer funds among institutes. So this is really important flexibility for the agency on how it's spent, and you just don't want to miss it just because it's tucked away in the general provisions. Next slide, please. So that's of the title, then general provisions of the Specific Appropriation Act, that is, they apply to the whole act. Next slide. This is an example of that just says that the agency has to give the House and Senate a report on the status of balances of appropriations. This is another recent trend where they want to know, have you obligated money? Have you not spent the money? How much is left? And these are instructions to the agency budget staff to provide these kind of reports. In these general provisions is where you also will find instructions that the agency has to provide a spending plan after the bill is enacted that tells the committee where they expect to spend the money. Another thing that's tucked away in these general provisions often are rescissions, as you'll see at the bottom of the page here, where they swipe money back. So I've seen rescissions even of money that is provided in the front of the bill. The back of the bill takes some of it away because often, as they're negotiating or voting on amendments, they start slapping amendments onto the back of the bill, and that's why they show up in these general provisions. Next slide, please. And finally, there are general provisions that apply government-wide. Next slide. These government-wide provisions, which are things like drug-free workplace or Buy America requirements, they apply to all agencies. These government-wide general provisions are usually found only in the financial services appropriation bill. That one of the 12 usually has them. So you may want to look at those as well, even though that bill may not be otherwise relevant for your agency. Next slide, please. One other thing you got to look for, government-wide, we just covered that, I'm sorry. Next slide. Multiple funding streams, that is, it's not just one place in this bill that your program gets money. It may be elsewhere as well. So it may be from a different bill, or it might be from a different part of the bill. So again, this is just a suggestion that you've got to be aware of where else your program may be mentioned. In this case, as it mentions here, these transfer authorities from one agency to another are allowed in there, and reprogramming instructions will also sometimes be found. That tells you can move money around. You have to, however, report to the Appropriations Committee if you're planning on using that flexibility. there's kind of a constitutional problem. You can't ask Congress to approve it. That would be a constitutional problem. So the administrations, Democratic and Republicans, generally have interpreted this as we need to notify the Appropriations Committee that we're using this authority. We're not asking for approval. We're just letting you know that we're using it. Even though if the committee disapproves, it's going to be a problem. Next slide, please. And appropriations from other acts, again, this is you may get money elsewhere. This is an example here where for the federal prisons, it says HHS can give us some money for the medical treatment for inmates. So sometimes your program gets money from other places. Next slide. This is just an example of sometimes it's a little tricky to find your program. So here's the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, which is under HHS. You'd think you'd find it in the HHS bill, but no, it's in the Agriculture Appropriations Bill where FDA is funded because it's sort of in a section along with food inspection and food quality. So be aware, you may get money from elsewhere.
I just want to interrupt because there are a couple of questions going back to previous stuff. It says, does anyone know where you can find the amount that has been enacted each year? And I think you covered that, but maybe just reinforce that.
How much has been enacted for each year? Yeah, one source, the president's budget shows it. Another one is that we're going to get to is in the back of the report language. There is a table that lists how much budget authority has been provided for each program. That's another source. But to me, as far as enacted, the best source is the prior year column in the president's budget appendix for your program. That's where you will consistently get the most detail. It goes down to a very low level of detail in the budget, and it's a reliable number. So I know I'm from OMB, but I've always found that to be the best source for what's enacted. CBO sometimes has others, but they're not as regular or common, I guess.
And I think you covered this. If earmarks are not in the appropriation bill, they're in the report language that's inserted into the congressional record. I think that's the answer to that question. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, what?
The question is, if earmarks are not in the appropriation bills, where do you find them?
Right. Yeah, they're generally in the report language. Some folks will stand up and say, well, report language does not have the force of law. If they really wanted to have the force of law, they'd put it in bill language. But as you can see, the listing of these earmarks goes on and on and on. And so it has been interpreted that report language has the force of law in that case. Although, it's another one of those legal issues that may come up. To what extent does the administration have to follow report language, which is not enacted law? That's true. Report is not bill language, but you ignore it at your peril, as we'll talk about shortly here. And I'm going to hustle through the rest here to leave time for some questions. Did you have another one, Andy?
Yeah. Where can you find the congressional report language?
That is, it's issued at the same time along with the bill usually. The easiest thing I found is you go on the web to the House or Senate Appropriations Committee, and it will list usually, like often in press releases, that hey, the committee passed the bill out. It will have a link to the bill, and it will have a link to the report
And-
yeah.
You can also go to congress.gov, which has, and then type in appropriations, and they have a nice table that tells you both the bill text and any reports.
Yeah, and to me, if reading the bill gets confusing and all, the report is supposed to really be the translator of it. It's supposed to be the plain English summary of what's in the bill. So oftentimes I'll start with the report language to figure out what's going on, and then look at the technical tortured bill language.
Okay.
Next slide. Yeah, so here's report language, briefly, that we'll talk about. Next slide. All right, so here's the bill language, that says about halfway through, 119 shall be available for carrying out special projects, blah, 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 that are detailed in the report. So next slide. That's the bill language. This is the report language, from the House that, describes and gives you 4 pages of instruction on how to administer your program, as well as on any earmarks. Next slide. So the House and the Senate, when they pass a bill, they will have their own individual reports. When it goes to conference, the House and Senate are negotiating out the final bill and making compromises. There is also an explanatory statement that accompanies that conference bill. That's the conference's version of the report language. It's important to read that to understand the disposition of what happened to when the House and Senate disagreed with each other. How was that resolved? Find that in this conference explanatory statement. For instance, over on the far right, you'll see in family planning, the last sentence there says the agreement does not include language proposed by the House. So just to make it clear, the House got stiffed on that one and the Senate won out. But that's the kind of stuff you got to look for. Next slide, please. Set asides, again, in reports, there are very useful tables, often, that have split outs like this one, that have the force of law. These splits set aside for epilepsy are not found in the bill language, but they are in the report language. And you basically have to follow them. If you have a problem with that, raise it up, and you can maybe bring it up with the appropriators. There is a procedure for that kind of to get clarification sometimes from the Appropriations Committee, or even get them to change their mind, or instructions on something. Next slide, please. And finally, in the back of the report is this combined statement of budget authority, or CSBA. And this, to me, is another place to maybe start. These are the tables that actually provide you. It's useful because there's your enacted column, as well as the request. That's the president's request. Then what's in the bill, and then what the deltas are. It will show you, for instance, the House and Senate bills, and then the final bill. These are extremely valuable tables. It's that these are basically Congressional Budget Office cost estimates for the bill. But again, if you've only got a few minutes to get up to speed, they throw the bill and report at you. Quick flashback to the last pages in the report to find these tables, and then take a look at the report language for your programs to understand just exactly what the hell Congress is trying to get at. Next slide. I think that's it. So just to summarize, here's all the wonderful stuff we went over. Again, understanding the purpose, amount, and time that the appropriations is providing for your program is key. Understanding chimps and changes in authorizing statutes is another one of those increasingly important issues. And for God's sake, take a look at report language. You ignore it at your peril. Any questions?
We have a couple minutes for questions.
Not, I'll ramble on. Shutdown, pending shutdown next Friday. Hopefully it's not going to happen. One interesting aspect, though, these days of that is in a shutdown situation, you and your agency have people designated as essential and non-essential, which of course are horrible phrases and not at all accurate, but nevertheless, that's what they're called. That your agency will suggest, propose, and designate who is essential. That is, who has to report to work in a shutdown situation, even though they're not going to be paid until maybe the appropriation bill is actually passed. But OMB will determine, take your list from the agency as to who's essential, and they will approve that or alter that. It will be interesting to see whether the OMB director sort of expands his the previous activity and authority for designating people in agencies who are essential. It may be a smaller list than prior years, but again, it's a brave new world. We'll see what happens there.
Any other questions?
The other interesting thing we haven't talked about, of course, is does the president have to follow this appropriations language, or is he impounding funds when they temporarily defer spending, such as they've done for some grant programs and for DEI programs and others? Congress said spend the money on this activity. The president said no, and these other activities I'm not going to. That's going to go to the courts to determine, does the appropriation bill, to what extent does it tie the president's hand, and to what extent does he have flexibility to ignore or differ from what's in appropriations language?
So last thing I want to share, this is Congress, the Congressional Research Service has the Congressional Appropriation Status Tracker. And this table, you can go to find stuff on what's going on with bills and stuff like that. Report language and all that. Yeah, okay. So here, it tells you, here's the status of all the various bills. Then you can click on the bills and you'll find continuing different information. So that's a good place to go. Okay, I think we'll turn it over to Janice to kind of close this out.
All right. Thank you so much. On behalf of Budget Line of Business, thank you, Mark, for presenting for us today. And we want to thank all of you that joined us this morning. If you're interested in joining us for the next session, it will be again at 10:30. I dropped the link in the chat box. That's Intro to Budget Execution 1. If you're not joining us, I want to say thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Mark.